The flashing lights sliced through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the quiet street. The sound of the sirens echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the chaos unfolding just beyond the reach of safety. Inside the small, crowded police station, Emily sat with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her breath shallow and rapid. Every muscle in her body screamed with fear, but she couldn't bring herself to move. She glanced at the door, hoping, praying that someone would come in and tell her this was all a mistake, that it wasn't really happening. But nothing happened. Nothing except the cold, oppressive silence that hung heavily in the air. The officer standing by the door wasn't a stranger. Emily had grown up hearing stories about him, about her uncle, the respected police captain, the man who had always been a symbol of integrity and justice in their small town. But now, here she was, arrested, sitting in the very place that symbolized everything her family had worked so hard to build. The captain, her uncle, was the last person she expected to see standing before her. And yet, in that moment, he seemed like the most impossible person to face. The door creaked open with a slow, deliberate sound. Emily's heart skipped a beat as her eyes locked onto the silhouette of the man who had helped raise her, the man who had always been there for her, guiding her, showing her the way. She had looked up to him her entire life, and now he was the one who would have to decide her fate. His face was unreadable, a stone mask that betrayed nothing, but his eyes, they were filled with something she couldn't quite place. Disappointment, anger, the weight of responsibility. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch clicking shut reverberating through the tense silence. Emily tried to steady her breath, but it was no use. Her chest felt tight, her throat dry. What was going to happen now? Was her uncle really going to be the one to make the hardest decision of his life, the one that could shatter everything they had ever known? "Emily," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that was hard to ignore. "What in the world were you thinking?" The words cut through the stillness like a knife. She wanted to speak, to explain, but no words came. The shame was too overwhelming. She had been caught up in something that was bigger than her, something she never expected to spiral out of control the way it had. She had tried to be strong, tried to convince herself that she could handle it. But here she was, her life unraveling in front of the one person she thought she could always count on. He paced in front of her, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. Every step felt like a hammer striking an anvil. The sound of his movements echoed in the silence, amplifying the tension in the room. Emily's mind raced, her thoughts tangled in confusion and regret. The consequences of her actions, the mistakes she had made, were now all coming to a head. How could she have let this happen? How could she have been so reckless? Her uncle stopped in front of her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to find some trace of the girl he used to know, the one who once made him proud, the one who had so much promise. "You're in a lot of trouble, Emily," he said softly, his voice not as harsh as she expected, but filled with an emotion she couldn't read. "This isn't just about you anymore. This is about everything we've worked for as a family. My job, my reputation, it's all at risk because of this." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't a child anymore. She wasn't the little girl who could cry her way out of trouble. She had to face the consequences of her actions, even if the weight of it all felt unbearable. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to drag you into this. I never wanted to be a disappointment." Her uncle's expression softened for a moment, the anger and frustration flickering in his eyes like a dying flame. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that seemed so out of place given the circumstances. "I know you didn't, Emily, but sometimes the choices we make have consequences we can't control." The air between them felt charged, heavy with unsaid words, with expectations, with years of family history. Emily couldn't look at him anymore, her gaze falling to the floor. She didn't deserve his kindness, his understanding. Not after everything she had done. "I don't know what to do," he confessed, his voice low. "I don't know what the right thing is anymore." There was a deep, almost heartbreaking honesty in his words. It was the kind of vulnerability Emily had never expected from him. Her uncle, the man who had always been so sure of himself, so steadfast in his beliefs, was now as lost as she felt. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening, each second stretching out longer than the last. Emily didn't know how to fix this, didn't know if anything could make it right again. All she could do was sit there, trapped in a moment where nothing made sense. The silence between them grew deeper, as if the weight of the moment was pressing down on both of them. Emily's thoughts were a blur, a jumbled mess of regret and confusion. She had always believed that her uncle, the man who had raised her, who had shown her right from wrong, would be able to fix everything. She had trusted that no matter what happened, he would know what to do. But now, sitting in this sterile, cold room, she realized that even he was just as lost as she was. Her uncle's hand remained on her shoulder, a steady, grounding presence in the midst of her spiraling thoughts. Yet the very weight of his touch only seemed to add to the overwhelming pressure building inside her chest. She felt as though the walls of the small room were closing in on her, suffocating her with each passing second. "You've always looked up to me, haven't you?" her uncle finally asked, his voice filled with a quiet sorrow. Emily nodded, unable to find the words. He continued, "I've always tried to do right by you, by everyone, but sometimes—" His voice trailed off, leaving an uncomfortable void hanging in the air. "Sometimes I wonder if I failed you." Emily's heart twisted in her chest at his words. How could he think he had failed her? He had always been there for her, guiding her through the toughest moments of her life. And yet, she couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that her actions had let him down in the worst way. How could she have put him in this impossible position? How could she have let herself spiral so far out of control? The door to the holding room opened, and a harsh light from the hallway poured in, casting a stark contrast to the dimness of the room. Emily flinched, blinking rapidly as the light temporarily blinded her. A young officer stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Captain," he said, addressing Emily's uncle, "they're asking if you want to make a statement about the situation." Her uncle exhaled sharply and turned his head, his gaze meeting Emily's one last time before he looked back at the officer. "No," he said firmly, the decision coming out of his mouth almost instinctively. "I'll deal with this on my own." The officer nodded and exited without a word, leaving the room just as quickly as he had entered. The moment he was gone, her uncle slumped against the wall, running a hand through his graying hair. Emily watched him, feeling both the weight of his exhaustion and her own. He was torn between duty and family, between the law and the love for his niece. It was clear now that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everything they had both worked so hard for, everything they had built. "I should have seen it coming," her uncle muttered, his voice barely audible. "I should have noticed sooner. All those signs. I was too focused on my work, too caught up in the system." He paused, his voice faltering as he glanced at her, his eyes filled with guilt. "I should have been there for you, Emily. You were never supposed to get caught up in something like this." Emily's stomach churned. Her heart ached for him. She could see it in his eyes, his heartbroken realization that, despite his best efforts, he couldn't protect her from herself. It wasn't his fault, not entirely. It was hers. She had let herself fall down a path she never should have gone down. The choices she made had led her here, and no one, not even her uncle, could undo that. For a moment, they sat in silence again, the tension hanging heavy in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Emily didn't know what to say. She didn't have the words to fix this, to make it better. She could only sit there, knowing that her actions had brought them both to this terrible crossroads. Her uncle, the strong, reliable man who had always been her protector, was now standing at the edge of a precipice, caught between family loyalty and his duty to uphold the law. "Do you think I can still fix this?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. She barely recognized the desperation in her tone, the raw vulnerability she was letting slip through. "Do you think? Can I ever make things right?" Her uncle's eyes softened as he stepped closer, kneeling down in front of her, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity she had never seen before. "I don't know, Emily," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean you stop trying." He paused, his hands clasping hers tightly. "You may not have all the answers now, but it's never too late to start again, to make a choice that leads you to a better path." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she squeezed his hands, her emotions finally breaking through the dam she had been holding back. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words, how much she needed to hear that there was still hope, that she wasn't beyond redemption. She had been so lost, so caught up in her own mess, that she had forgotten what it felt like to believe in herself. But in that moment, as her uncle spoke to her with a mixture of love and compassion, she felt a flicker of something inside her, a spark of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, barely able to get the words out through the lump in her throat. He smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "It's not over, Emily. You've got a long way to go, but you don't have to do it alone. We'll figure this out together." Her heart swelled with a mixture of relief and fear. She had no idea what the future would hold, no idea how this story would end. But for the first time since the arrest, Emily finally felt like she could breathe again. There was a chance, a real chance, for her to make things right. And for the first time in a long time, she believed in it. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cold, empty hallway outside the holding room, the sound sharp against the silence that enveloped them both. Emily's mind buzzed, her thoughts still swirling in confusion, but there was something else there now, something stronger than just fear. It was the feeling of a new beginning, a possibility of change that she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. Her uncle's words had pierced through the fog of regret that had clouded her judgment, but the road ahead was uncertain. There was no clear answer. Only time would tell if she could truly overcome the weight of her mistakes. Her uncle, the man who had always known exactly what to do, now seemed just as uncertain as she was. He wasn't the same unwavering figure she remembered. He had let doubt creep in, as if the choices he had made in his own life had started to unravel, one after another. But now, facing the choice of whether to help her or let the law take its course, he had made the most difficult decision of all, to fight for her. That was something she couldn't ignore, something that made her realize that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Her uncle's phone rang, a shrill sound cutting through the moment of quiet. He looked at it for a moment, the uncertainty in his eyes deepening. The caller ID flashed with an unfamiliar number, but his expression hardened. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, walking to the window and looking out at the dimly lit street. Emily could see his reflection in the glass, his face drawn, weary from the weight of everything. The sirens from earlier still echoed in the distance, but they seemed distant now, faint and muffled, like the events of the night had already begun to fade into the background. "Are you going to answer that?" Emily asked softly, though she already knew what his answer would be. The tension in the room had thickened, and now her voice seemed to punctuate the silence that had settled like a heavy fog. Her uncle's hand lingered on the edge of the window, but he didn't move toward the phone. Instead, he exhaled sharply, as if releasing the breath he had been holding for far too long. "I should," he said quietly, "but I don't know if I'm ready for the consequences." Consequences. Emily's voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of her uncle's words sinking in. "What about me? What about the consequences of my actions?" He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a complexity of emotion. "You're not the only one facing consequences here, Emily. But right now, the decision I make will affect both of us. If I take this to the department, if I let them handle it the way they would handle anyone else, everything changes. My job, my life, everything. But I can't let you go down this road alone. I know what it's like to have everything you've worked for fall apart. I won't let that happen to you." The gravity of his words hit her like a tidal wave. Emily's mind raced as she tried to understand just how far her uncle was willing to go to help her. She had always known he was a man of principle, a man who followed the law without question. But now, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the internal struggle on his face, Emily realized the true cost of his decision. He was sacrificing more than just his job. He was risking everything to help her, to give her a chance when most people would have turned their backs. The phone rang again, louder this time, forcing her uncle to break eye contact and walk over to the desk where it sat. He hesitated for just a moment before he picked it up. Emily couldn't hear the conversation, but the tension in his body was palpable, every movement a sign of the conflict he was feeling inside. The quiet hum of the conversation on the other end filled the space between them, but it wasn't enough to drown out the chaos that seemed to rage within Emily's mind. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was becoming clear. She would have to fight for her own redemption, no matter how hard it might be. When the call finally ended, her uncle placed the phone back down, his eyes clouded with even more uncertainty. He took a seat beside her, his face pale, as though the weight of the world had suddenly pressed down on him once more. "That was the chief," he said quietly. "He's not happy." Emily's heart sank at the mention of the chief. The captain had always worked hard to maintain his reputation, to ensure that the department respected him. The thought of him having to answer for her actions sent a chill through her. She didn't want to be the cause of his downfall, but in that moment, she realized something that shook her to the core. Her choices weren't just her own anymore. They had rippled out into the world around her, affecting everyone she loved. "You don't have to do this, Uncle," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll face the consequences. I'll figure it out. I don't want to ruin your life." He reached out, placing his hand over hers, his grip firm yet comforting. "You're not ruining anything. I'm doing this because I believe in you, Emily. I believe you can turn things around. I wouldn't have made this decision if I didn't believe in you." Her throat tightened at his words. It was more than she deserved, more than she thought she could ever receive after everything she had done. But in that moment, she realized that her uncle's faith in her was the spark she needed to begin again. She might not have all the answers, but she couldn't afford to keep running away from the truth. She had to own up to what she had done and find a way to make things right. The days ahead would be long. The path to redemption was never easy, and it was filled with uncertainty. But for the first time since her arrest, Emily felt something she hadn't in a long time, a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone. And even if the road was hard, she knew that with her uncle's support, she could face whatever came next. Together, they would figure it out, one step at a time. The days that followed were a blur of tense moments and heavy decisions. Emily found herself trapped between the fear of facing the consequences of her actions and the need to prove she was capable of changing. The weight of her uncle's sacrifice hung over her like a shadow, and the realization that he was willing to risk his entire career to give her a chance. This chance was both humbling and terrifying. Every morning, she woke with the cold knowledge that the world around her had shifted, that she no longer had the luxury of ignoring the consequences of her choices. But the first few weeks passed in a haze, each one blending into the next. There were meetings with lawyers, a quiet investigation into the events that led to her arrest, and countless conversations with her uncle, who had gone from a figure of certainty in her life to someone who, too, was navigating an unknown path. One evening, after a particularly draining meeting with the department, her uncle returned home exhausted, his face drawn, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. He sat down at the kitchen table without a word, running a hand over his face, as if trying to erase the burden of the decisions he'd made. Emily sat across from him, her own heart heavy with guilt. She didn't know how to fix what had happened, but she knew she had to try. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Emily." He finally spoke, his voice low, almost apologetic. "There are days when I wonder if I've made the biggest mistake of my life. I put everything on the line for you. My career, my reputation. It's hard to keep going when everything's falling apart around us." The words stung. She had known her uncle's struggles would be hard, but hearing him speak them aloud made it all too real. He was a man who had built his life around duty, around upholding the law, and now that same duty was the very thing that threatened to tear apart the life he had worked so hard to create. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. How could she apologize for all the damage she had caused? How could she ever make up for the pain and strain she had put on him, on their entire family? He shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with a sorrow that made her heart ache. "It's not just about you, Emily. It's about everything. About what's right and what's just. There are people in this department who don't understand why I'm doing this. They think I'm showing favoritism. They think I'm letting you off the hook because you're my family. And maybe they're right. I don't know. But if I don't fight for you, who will?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Emily could feel the weight of it pressing down on both of them. Who would fight for her? Her uncle was fighting, but at what cost? She could see the strain on his face, the conflict in his every movement. This was no longer just about one girl making a mistake. It was about everything. The expectations, the sacrifices, the systems that were now in motion because of one poor decision. The next few weeks brought their own set of challenges. Emily began working with a counselor to address the root causes of her behavior, exploring the feelings of alienation and the slow spiral of self-doubt that had led her to make reckless decisions. She started attending group therapy, meeting people who, like her, had made mistakes and were now trying to rebuild their lives from the rubble they had created. It wasn't easy, and the road ahead felt endless, but there was something healing in those moments of vulnerability, in seeing that she wasn't alone in her struggle. Through it all, her uncle remained steadfast, though the tension in their house grew with each passing day. He was trying, truly trying, to hold everything together, but Emily could see the cracks forming in his resolve. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, and the toll of trying to protect her while navigating the fallout from his decisions weighed heavily on him. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, he came home later than usual, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Emily was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when he entered the living room. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at her as though he had something important to say but couldn't find the right words. Finally, he spoke. "I spoke with the chief today," he said, his voice quiet. "It doesn't look good. There's talk of disciplinary action. Some people are calling for my resignation. I don't know if I can fight this anymore. Emily, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." The gravity of his words hit Emily like a physical blow. He had been the rock, the unwavering figure in her life. But now, she realized, even rocks could crack under pressure. Her uncle was breaking, and it was her fault. She couldn't bear the thought of him losing everything because of her. "Uncle, I never wanted any of this," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. "I don't want you to lose everything for me. I don't want you to fight for me anymore if it's going to destroy you." His eyes softened, a faint trace of a sad smile on his lips. "It's not about you, Emily. It's about doing what's right, even when it costs us everything. But I'm not the only one in this fight. You've got to decide if you're willing to fight too." The words stung, but they were also the truth. It was time for her to step up, to take responsibility for her actions, and face the consequences, no matter how hard it was. No longer could she hide behind the protection of her uncle's sacrifices. No longer could she let him bear the weight of her mistakes. The following weeks were filled with hard decisions, late-night talks, and a lot of self-reflection. Emily began working harder than ever, not just on her personal growth, but also on taking responsibility for what she had done. It wasn't easy. Some days felt like walking through quicksand, every step forward feeling like a struggle. But she kept going, because she knew now that this wasn't just about her. It was about her uncle, about their family, and about the future they both had to rebuild, no matter how hard the road ahead seemed. And as the months passed, something began to shift. Slowly, Emily started to feel like herself again, like she could be the person she had always dreamed of being, not defined by her mistakes, but by how she chose to rise above them. The road was still long, but for the first time, she saw the possibility of something better. And with her uncle's quiet support, she knew that she had the strength to keep fighting, even when the odds were stacked against her. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would build a future from the ashes of their past. The months wore on, each one passing with a mixture of relentless pressure and tentative hope. Emily's life had become a series of small, incremental steps toward redemption. Every day was an opportunity to prove to herself and her uncle that she could rise above the mistakes of her past, that she could build a future that was no longer defined by the chaos she had caused. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when the guilt clawed at her insides and the temptation to give up loomed larger than ever. But then she would look at her uncle, who had become her anchor through it all, and remember the sacrifices he had made for her. He had chosen to stand by her, even when the world seemed to be falling apart around them both. Her uncle's decision to help her had come at a high cost, one that they both understood all too well. He had fought tooth and nail to keep his position within the department, to maintain his reputation and career, but the strain of that battle was starting to show. He had always been the strong one, the one who carried the weight of their family's expectations, but now it was clear that he was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and spiritually drained. The toll of trying to protect Emily, of holding everything together, was more than even he could bear. He wasn't just fighting for his job anymore. He was fighting for their future, for the belief that he could still be the man his family needed him to be. Despite his struggle, Emily could see the small victories, moments when he smiled, however fleeting, or when he offered her a word of encouragement when she was feeling down. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was enough for her to keep pushing forward, to keep working toward a future where they could both find peace. It was a long, hard road, but there was something deeply transformative about those quiet, everyday moments. She realized that healing didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, in the small gestures of kindness, the late-night talks, and the quiet acknowledgments of progress. It wasn't just her uncle who had to learn to let go of the past. Emily herself had to grapple with the ghosts of her decisions, the weight of the pain she had caused, and the realization that she couldn't change what had already happened. It was hard to accept that her past mistakes had shaped her future in ways she couldn't undo, but she also realized that it was those very mistakes that had led her to where she was now. In the midst of her darkest moments, she had found the strength to face the truth, to confront her fears, and to take ownership of her life. One evening, after another long day of work and therapy sessions, Emily sat at the kitchen table, the remnants of dinner still scattered on the plates in front of her. Her uncle was in the other room, his voice low as he spoke to a colleague on the phone. The house was quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. Emily stared at the remnants of her meal, her thoughts drifting as she tried to process everything that had happened in the past months. The guilt still lingered, but now there was a sense of clarity, of understanding. She had made mistakes, yes, but she was learning. She was changing. Her uncle's voice brought her back to the present. "I've been thinking," he said, stepping into the room, his expression serious but softer than usual, "about everything, about us. And I realized something." He sat down across from her, his hands resting on the table, his eyes locking with hers. "You've been fighting so hard, Emily. You've been doing the work. I know it's been hard, but you've come a long way. And maybe, just maybe, I've been too focused on the things I've lost to see the things we've gained." Emily's heart tightened. She wasn't used to hearing him admit vulnerability, to hear him speak about his own struggles. It was like a veil had been lifted, and she saw her uncle for the first time not as the impenetrable figure of authority she had always known him to be, but as a man who was learning to let go of his own burdens, to accept that he didn't have to carry everything alone. It was a humbling moment, one that filled her with both sorrow and hope. "I've been hard on you," her uncle continued, his voice thick with emotion. I've expected too much from you, demanded too much. But I realize now that I need to let you make your own choices, your own mistakes. I've been trying to protect you, but sometimes the best thing I can do is step back and let you stand on your own." As the weeks turned into months, Emily's world began to shift in ways she hadn't expected. There were moments of doubt, moments where the old fears crept in, whispering that she wasn't strong enough, that the past would always define her. But then there were other moments, small, almost imperceptible shifts, that reminded her she was more than her mistakes. Each new day presented an opportunity to redefine herself, and slowly, Emily began to see the woman she was becoming. Her relationship with her uncle, once built on the rigid structure of authority and expectation, had evolved into something far more complex and tender. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it was real. They had moved from a place of unspoken burdens to one where they could speak honestly about their fears, their regrets, and their hopes. They didn't have all the answers, but they had something more valuable: understanding and a shared commitment to move forward, no matter how hard it might be. One evening, after a particularly long and grueling therapy session, Emily found herself sitting on the porch of their modest house, her feet dangling over the edge of the steps as she watched the sunset bleed across the sky. It had been a long day, one of those days where progress felt slow, and the weight of everything she had to overcome seemed heavier than usual. But as she sat there, letting the cool evening breeze brush against her skin, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She wasn't there yet. There were still so many things to work through, so many scars that needed time to heal. But for the first time in months, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she was on the right path. Her uncle came out to join her, his tired eyes softening when he saw her sitting there, lost in thought. He had always been the one to keep things together, to hold the pieces in place. But now, as he sat down beside her, Emily realized that they were both on this journey together. The struggles had changed them both, but in some ways, they had brought them closer. "You're quiet tonight," her uncle remarked gently, settling beside her. "Everything okay?" Emily let out a soft breath, the kind that felt like a release of everything she had been holding in. "Yeah, I think so," she replied, her voice still carrying the weight of her journey. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel like I'm really moving forward. I mean, there are days when it feels like I'm stuck in the past, you know. Like I can't outrun the mistakes I made." Her uncle sat quietly for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I get that," he said, his voice low but filled with understanding. "But here's the thing. You don't have to outrun your past. You just have to keep walking forward, one step at a time. The past doesn't define you unless you let it. And from where I'm sitting, you're doing everything you can to move beyond it." Emily nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. She had spent so much time trying to distance herself from the girl she used to be, from the mistakes that had nearly destroyed her, but maybe her uncle was right. Maybe the key wasn't in running from the past, but in accepting it and allowing it to shape her into someone stronger. "I'm proud of you, Emily," her uncle continued, his voice gentle but filled with a quiet pride. "Not just for the progress you've made, but for how hard you're fighting. It's not easy, and there are going to be days where you feel like giving up. But you're still here, and that means something." Her chest tightened at his words, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself feel the full weight of the gratitude she had been carrying. It wasn't just his actions that had kept her going. It was his belief in her, even when she hadn't believed in herself. She realized then that their journey wasn't just about her redemption. It was about both of them. The bond they shared, built on trust and sacrifice, had become the foundation for the new life they were both trying to build. "I'm not sure I'll ever be perfect," Emily said, her voice small but determined. "I don't think I can ever go back to being who I was before all of this happened. But I think that's okay. I think I just need to focus on being better than I was yesterday." Her uncle smiled softly, his hand resting on hers in a gesture of reassurance. "And that's enough. You don't need to be perfect. Just keep trying. That's all anyone can ask for." And so, they sat there, side by side, watching the last of the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily allowed herself to simply be. She let go of the constant need to be someone else, to be someone better, and embraced the person she was becoming. She wasn't perfect, and maybe she never would be. But she was learning, growing, and moving forward, one step at a time. The days that followed were a continuation of that quiet strength she had begun to build. She continued her therapy sessions, not because she had to, but because she wanted to understand herself better. She worked harder at rebuilding her relationships, at making amends where she could and accepting the parts of herself she had spent so long trying to bury. She began to see herself not as a person defined by her past mistakes, but as someone capable of change, someone who could rise above the challenges life had thrown her way. Her uncle, too, found his footing again. The toll of the past months had been immense, but slowly he began to reclaim the confidence that had once defined him. He was still the same man, but he had softened in ways that Emily had never expected. He was no longer the unshakable pillar of strength he had once been, but instead he had become a more human version of himself, one who acknowledged his own vulnerabilities, his own fears, and his own capacity for growth. Together, they had found something that had eluded them for so long. Peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came easily or without effort. It was the kind that was built slowly, through hard work, through humility, through the quiet understanding that both of them were still in the process of becoming who they were meant to be. One day, as they stood in the kitchen, Emily looked at her uncle, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You know," she said, "we're still not where we want to be. But I think we're finally heading in the right direction." Her uncle looked back at her, a rare moment of tenderness in his eyes. "We always have been. We just had to stop trying to control everything and start trusting that the path would unfold in its own time." And in that moment, Emily understood something she hadn't before. Healing wasn't about rushing to the end or trying to fix everything at once. It was about taking each step, no matter how small, with the confidence that, in time, things would fall into place. She didn't need to know exactly where she was going. She just needed to keep moving forward. And as long as they continued to walk this path together, she knew they would both be okay.